please, we need to get him to the hospital!
Three Navy corpsmen worked on the dying recruit for almost 6 minutes. Pressure bandages, hemostatic gauze, 2 tourniquet attempts that did nothing because you cannot tourniquet a shoulder. The training officer looked at her watch and opened her mouth to say the words no one at Parris Island ever wants to say over an 18-year-old. Time of... That was when the chow hall door banged open and a 78-year-old cook walked out into the morning light, wiping his hands on his apron. One of the corpsmen shouted at him to get back. He didn't. He knelt in the blood, slid off his belt, pressed 2 fingers into a spot below the boy's collarbone that none of them had ever been taught, and in 90 seconds he did what 3 trained medics couldn't do in 6 minutes. If you believe quiet heroes still walk among us, type honour in the comments right now, because this story is going to stay with you. Harlan Mercer had been frying eggs at Marine Corps Recruit Depot Parris Island for 22 years, and in all that time almost nobody had ever asked him a single question about himself. He was 78 years old, tall once but stooped now, with forearms like braided rope and a face the colour and texture of an old saddle. He wore the same thing every day: black non-slip shoes, grey work trousers, a white kitchen smock, and underneath it all, threaded through the belt loops of those grey trousers, a faded olive-green rigger's belt so old the webbing had gone soft as cloth, its brass buckle dulled to the colour of swamp water. The younger kitchen staff had offered to buy him a new one for his birthday 2 years back. He had smiled, thanked them, and kept wearing the old one. He arrived at the chow hall at 03:30 every morning, before the drill instructors, before the duty officers, before anyone except the seagulls. He moved through the kitchen the way water moves through a creek bed. No wasted motion, no noise, and he had a habit the dishwashers joked about but never understood. Every time he passed the long stainless prep table, his left hand would drift out and touch the corner of it. 2 fingers, light as a moth, like a man counting something. His left hand trembled just slightly when it was idle. It never trembled when it was working. The recruits knew him only as the Eggman, the silent fixture behind the steam tables who somehow remembered which homesick 18-year-old liked his eggs over hard and slid an extra strip of bacon onto the trays of the ones who'd had a bad week on the rifle range, as if he could read it off their faces, which he could. The drill instructors knew him as the one civilian on the depot who had never once been rattled by anything, not kitchen fires, not hurricanes, not the colonel's surprise inspections. The other cooks knew that he had buried his wife, Dottie, 11 years ago, that he visited her grave at the Beaufort National Cemetery every Sunday afternoon with a folding chair and a thermos, and sat there for exactly 1 hour, and that he had turned down retirement 4 separate times, telling the food service contractor each time in the same words, "I've still got use in my hands." Nobody knew what he meant by that. Nobody asked. He lived alone in a small cinder block house off Ribote Road with a vegetable garden in military rows and a porch light he left on all night, every night, for reasons he had never explained to a living soul. He kept a photograph taped inside his locker, sun-bleached almost to white, of 2 young men in cut-off fatigues standing in front of a wall of jungle so green it looked black. He never talked about it, but what nobody at that depot knew, not the cooks, not the corpsmen, not the colonel who ran the place, was that the quiet old man scrambling their eggs had once been flown, under guard, into a classified briefing room in Saigon because of what those 2 trembling fingers knew how to do. Parris Island in late May is a furnace with a flag on it. The recruits of Lima Company, 3rd Battalion, were 2 weeks from the crucible, that final brutal rite of passage, and the depot around them was in the middle of a renovation cycle, which meant chain-link fencing, torn-up concrete pads, and orange-painted rebar stakes jutting up out of half-poured foundations behind hurricane netting 50 yards from the chow hall. Recruit Devon Yates, 18 years old out of Dayton, Ohio, was the kind of kid drill instructors privately liked and publicly destroyed. Skinny, earnest, all elbows and effort, the first one in his family to do anything in a uniform. He had a habit of writing his mother every Sunday whether he had anything to say or not, sitting on the end of his rack with a golf pencil, printing carefully because she'd taught 3rd grade for 30 years and would notice. His father had left when he was 6. His mother cleaned offices at night and had cried into his shoulder at the recruiter's parking lot. Not because she didn't want him to go, but because she did, and that was somehow worse. He'd lost 11 pounds in 9 weeks and gained something in his spine that the mirror in the squad bay head showed him a little more of every morning. 3 days earlier, in the chow line, the old cook had looked at him for 1 extra half-second, the way he sometimes did, and put 2 extra strips of bacon on his tray without a word. Devon had said, "Thank you, sir." The cook had said nothing at all. That morning, Lima Company was running the fence line in formation under Staff Sergeant Vega's cadence, 80 boots hitting the crushed shell path in rhythm, the sun not yet fully up and already cruel. Watching from the chow hall's screen door, the way he watched every morning with a cup of black coffee going cold in his hand, stood Harlan Mercer. The duty corpsmen, 3 of them, were posted near the obstacle course with their aid bags, boards, swatting sandflies. Hospital corpsman 2nd Class Brock Tillman, the senior of the 3, was 29, capable, proud of it, and in a foul mood about a transfer he hadn't gotten. None of them had any reason to believe this morning would be different from 1,000 others, but the ground beside that fence line had been undermined by a week of rain, and beneath the boots of Lima Company, 18 inches of earth was quietly waiting to give way, and when it did, every second of the next 8 minutes would be measured against a clock that had started ticking 55 years earlier in a riverbed in Laos. It happened on the 2nd lap. The path bent around the construction fencing, and the recruit in front of Devon Yates drifted wide, and Devon, doing the polite thing, the Ohio thing, stepped left to give him room. The earth at the edge of the path simply wasn't there anymore. His left foot went down into nothing, the rain-hollowed ground collapsing under him, and he pitched sideways through a gap in the hurricane netting and came down with his full weight across the top of an exposed rebar stake. The orange safety cap long since knocked off by some forklift. The steel entered just below his left collarbone, at the junction of shoulder and chest, and tore back out as his body rolled. For 1 second he didn't understand what had happened. Then the blood came, and everyone understood at once. Staff Sergeant Vega's whistle cut the morning in half. The corpsman covered the distance in seconds, Tillman shouting, "Move! Move! Give me space!" And the formation broke apart into a ring of grey-faced teenagers. Tillman got his knee into the wound and his weight behind it and felt, immediately, the thing every trauma medic dreads, pressure that did nothing. The blood wasn't oozing past his hands, it was pulsing, arterial, coming up from somewhere deep beneath the collarbone where his palm could not reach. Behind the ring of recruits, the screen door of the chow hall opened. Harlan Mercer stepped out onto the concrete, coffee cup still in his hand, and stood very still, watching the blood pattern on the crushed shells. He was not watching the way the recruits were watching, with horror, or the way Vega was watching, with helpless fury. He was reading it, the way a farmer reads a sky. The spray pattern, the rate, the colour, the location of Tillman's knee, the angle of the boy's arm, and the math assembled itself in his head with terrible old fluency, high and deep, behind the clavicle, 6 minutes, maybe 7, in a kid that size. He had done this arithmetic before with the answer screaming under his hands. He took 4 steps forward. "Sir," Tillman barked without looking up. "Back up, medical scene, back up." And Harlan Mercer, who had been told to back up before in louder voices in worse places, stopped where he was and watched and started counting. Hospital Corpsman 3rd Class. Priyanaya packed the wound channel with hemostatic gauze, an entire package, then a second, her hands disappearing red to the wrist. Hospitalman Joshua Reyes, 19, on his first duty station, cut away the sodden PT shirt and tried to find an angle, any angle, for pressure. Tillman called for a junctional tourniquet that the aid bags didn't carry, swore, and tried a standard CAT tourniquet rigged high around the shoulder and across the chest, knowing as he cinched it that it was geometry against anatomy, and anatomy was winning. The bleeding slowed for 10 seconds and surged again. He repositioned it, cranked the windlass until the boy's whole shoulder went white, and watched the blood find its way around anyway, because the vessel was bleeding from behind the collarbone, upstream of anything a strap could compress, in the one junction of the human body that the entire concept of a tourniquet cannot reach. This is the nightmare they whisper about in corpsman school. Junctional hemorrhage, the wound in the seam, where the arm meets the chest and the textbooks start using phrases like surgical control that mean nothing on a gravel path at dawn. Tillman knew all of it, knowing it did not help. Captain Dana Holcomb, the series training officer, arrived at a dead run with her radio already keyed, calling for the ambulance, calling for the air bridge to Beaufort, doing everything right, every box checked, and none of it mattering. She had a folder of paperwork in her vehicle with Harlan Mercer's name in it, as it happened. 2 weeks earlier, she had flagged the Chow Hall civilian staffing contract for review, had written the words, "Aging workforce, recommend assessment" next to his name without ever once having spoken to him. Now she stood over a dying recruit while the old line item from her spreadsheet watched from 30 feet away. "How long?" she demanded. 6 minutes out for the ambulance," someone said. Tillman looked up at her, and his face said what his mouth wouldn't. Devon Yates's lips had gone the colour of dishwater. He was asking for his mother, politely, the way he did everything. And 50 yards away, an old man set his coffee cup down on the ground, very carefully, the way you set something down when you know you aren't coming back for it. The recruits had been pushed back into a ragged line, ordered to face away, though half of them didn't. Reyes was doing compressions math in his head, and getting answers he didn't want. Nia had her fingers buried in the wound to the second knuckle, trying to find the vessel by feel, the way they'd taught her in a classroom with a mannequin that did not scream, and the boy was screaming less now, which was worse. Tillman keyed his own radio and said the words, "massive hemorrhage, left subclavian region, uncontrolled," and heard his own voice say, "uncontrolled," like it belonged to someone else. Captain Holcomb looked at her watch. It was a thing she would see in her sleep for years, the act of looking at that watch. 6 minutes since the fall. The textbook said a complete subclavian transection emptied a human body in about that. This was partial, which had bought them time, and the time was spent. Her thumb found the radio toggle. Protocol had a sentence for this, and she had been trained to say it without her voice breaking. "All stations, stand by, time of..." She never finished it, because the screen door of the Chow Hall had already swung shut, and Harlan Mercer was already walking through the ring of recruits the way a man walks across his own kitchen, untucking his smock, his hands moving to the brass buckle of that ancient olive belt, and what nobody on that crushed shell path could have known was that this exact wound, in this exact spot, in a boy this exact age, was the one thing on earth Harlan Mercer had spent 55 years waiting for a second chance at. To understand what happened next, you would have had to be inside the old man's head, and nobody had been allowed in there for half a century. Harlan Mercer was not seeing Parris Island. He was seeing a riverbed outside a place whose name was still classified in the first week of March, 1971, and a 20-year-old radio operator from Baton Rouge named Tobias Farrow, who everyone called Toby, who told jokes so badly that the punchlines became the jokes, who carried a picture of a sister. He swore was smarter than the whole team put together, and who had taken a round through the same junction of shoulder and chest, and who had died under Harlan's hands in 9 minutes because every technique in the manual assumed you could reach the artery, and you could not reach the artery. Not from the front, not through the wound, not with pressure, not with anything they had been taught. 2 weeks after they zipped Toby into a bag, Harlan, who was then called something else with a rank in front of it, had been sitting in a hospital in Japan reading a cadaver lab anatomy text a Navy surgeon had left behind, and he had found it. The one place where the subclavian artery crosses the first rib like a garden hose over a fence rail, reachable from above, behind the collarbone, if a man knew the angle and had the nerve to push. He had practiced it on himself until his arm went numb. He had used it 11 times in the next 8 months. 9 of those men were still alive somewhere in America, mowing lawns, spoiling grandchildren. But the technique had come 14 days too late for Toby Farrow, and Harlan Mercer had been carrying those 14 days in his chest like shrapnel ever since. Touching the corner of the prep table every morning, twice, once for the boy and once for the lateness. He had told Dottie about Toby exactly once, in 1983 at 2 in the morning, and she had held his head against her collarbone of all places and never asked again, and the porch light had burned every night since for a kid from Baton Rouge who never found his way home. Old men are not supposed to run, and Harlan Mercer did not run now. He walked, but it was a walk that ate ground, the same gait that had carried 160 pounds of dying men across borders that officially did not exist, and the recruits parted in front of him without being ordered to, because some part of the animal brain knows when something serious is moving through. Now his knees hit the bloody crushed shells beside Devon Yates, and Tillman grabbed his shoulder, shouting, and Captain Holcomb was shouting too. And Harlan Mercer said the first full sentence anyone on that depot had heard from him in years. "Son," he said quietly to Tillman, "you can stop me in 90 seconds. Count them." There are moments when authority is not given or taken but simply recognized, the way animals recognize weather. Something in the old man's voice, in the absolute economy of his hands, made Tillman's grip loosen for exactly the seconds Mercer needed. The belt came free of his trouser loops in one pull, 55-year-old webbing soft as a dish rag, and he folded it once, twice, into a dense pad the size of a fist, and set it not on the wound, but above it, in the hollow behind the collarbone. Then he climbed his bare fingers along the bone like a man reading Braille, found the notch he was looking for, the one he could have found blindfolded, drunk, dying, and pressed 2 fingertips down and back at an angle no field manual in 1971 had ever printed, pinning the subclavian artery against the first rib the way you'd pin a hose against a fence rail. He put the folded belt over his own fingers, leaned his body weight through the heel of his other hand, and looked at his watch, a scratched Seiko with no glass left to glare. "Pressure's proximal now," he said, to no one and to everyone. "The leak's downstream of my fingers. Watch the wound." Nia watched. The wound, which had pulsed like a living thing for 6 endless minutes, slowed, then seeped, then, impossibly, stopped. The silence that followed was its own kind of sound. Somewhere a gull screamed. Devon Yates, grey and drifting, opened his eyes halfway and found the old face above him. "There you are," Mercer said, as if greeting him in the chow line. "Devon, isn't it? Over hard. Wheat toast. You stay looking at me now." The boy's lips moved. "Am I dying?" "No, son," the old man said, with the flat certainty of a man reading a thermometer. "Not today. Today's spoken for." Reyes made a sound that was not a word. Tillman stared at the old man's 2 fingers as if they were on fire, his mind running through every page of every manual he had ever studied, and finding this nowhere, finding nothing, finding only a cook kneeling in 6 minutes of failure and turning it off like a faucet. 90 seconds, Mercer said mildly, eyes on the broken watch. "I did say count." Captain Holcomb stood frozen with her radio still raised, the unfinished sentence still in her mouth, and at that precise moment, 90 miles north in Charleston, a 2-star admiral of the United States Navy was buttoning his choker whites for a routine hospital visit, with no idea that before sundown he would be standing at attention in a Parris Island chow hall with tears on his face. The ambulance arrived to find a scene nobody had briefed them for. 3 corpsmen kneeling in a half-circle like students, and an old man in a bloody kitchen smock holding a boy's life shut with 2 fingers and a folded belt. Mercer would not let go for the transfer. He simply climbed onto the gurney alongside Devon Yates, kept the pressure locked, and rode the whole way like that, his arm cramping into stone, sweat running into his collar, murmuring to the semi-conscious recruit the entire time in a low-level voice. "You're all right, son. You write your mama Sundays. You'll write her this Sunday. Stay with the sound of me." The young ambulance corpsman tried once, gently, to take over the pressure point, and Mercer said, without heat, "Son, it took me 11 tries to learn the angle, and 3 of those men have grandchildren. We'll keep it where it is." Nobody argued with him again. At Beaufort Naval Hospital, the trauma team took the handoff in the bay, and the attending surgeon, Commander Alicia Whitfield, got her first look at the field intervention and stopped moving for a full 2 seconds, which trauma surgeons do not do. In the operating room she found a subclavian artery torn nearly through and a surgical field so dry she could see what she was sewing. Afterwards, scrubbing out, she said to her resident, "Whoever held proximal pressure on that boy used supraclavicular subclavian compression. Do you know what we call that?" The resident shook his head. "The Mercer maneuver," she said. "It's in the junctional hemorrhage literature. 1970-something, some Special Forces medic worked it out in the field. No surgical equipment, nothing. We teach it as history. I've never once seen it done." She pulled off her gloves, frowning at a thought arriving sideways. The corpsman said the man who did it was the base cook. She stood there a moment. "And the duty log says his name is Mercer." Then she went to find a phone, because as it happened, the deputy chief of the Navy Bureau of Medicine and Surgery was in her building that very afternoon, shaking hands and touring wards, and there was exactly one name on this earth guaranteed to stop that man mid-stride. Back at the depot, the morning curdled into something strange. Devon Yates was alive, in surgery, critical but holding, and the relief should have been simple, but it wasn't, because relief has a way of turning into accounting. The recruits of Lima Company had been marched back, showered, and fed, and the meal had been served by a kitchen staff 1 man short, and not one of them could stop watching the empty station at the flat-top grill. Staff Sergeant Vega, 14 years a Marine, hard as a paving stone, had pulled the watch logbook and found the cook's name and stood looking at it for a long time. He'd been eating that man's eggs for 3 duty stations worth of years. He thought about every morning he'd walked past him without a word, and he found, to his own surprise, that his ears were hot. Captain Holcomb sat in her office with an incident report glowing on her screen, and a paragraph she had typed and deleted 4 times. The paragraph about an unauthorized civilian entering an active medical scene. Regulation said it plainly. Her own voice, on the recorded radio net, could be heard beginning the time of death call that the civilian had interrupted. She had listened to the recording twice with the door locked. Both times her skin had crawled at how close it had been, how procedurally correct she had sounded, announcing the end of a boy whose heart had 40 more beats of margin in it. H. 2. Tillman stood in front of her desk with his cover in his hands and his pride in pieces, and pride in pieces is a dangerous thing, because it reaches for whatever is closest. "Ma'am, with respect, we don't actually know what we saw," he said. "Could have been luck. Could have been the gauze finally taking hold, the tourniquet, any of it. An untrained civilian put his hands inside our scene. If that kid had died with the cook's fingers in his chest, that's a headline. That's a court-martial question. That's—" He stopped because he could hear himself, and what he heard was a man arguing against a miracle because the miracle had embarrassed him. Holcomb rubbed her eyes. On her desk sat the staffing review folder, the one with aging workforce recommend assessment, written in her own neat hand beside the name Mercer, H. "Where is he now?" she asked. "Back in the chow hall, ma'am, prepping lunch," like nothing happened. She stared at him. "He rode a medevac holding a boy's artery shut, and he came back and he's prepping lunch." "Yes, ma'am." Neither of them said anything for a moment. Neither of them knew that a black government SUV had already cleared the front gate of the depot, that its plates were drawing salutes from every sentry it passed, and that the man in the back seat had been rehearsing what he was going to say for 30 years. Rear Admiral Marcus Tate, Medical Corps, United States Navy, 58 years old, 2 stars, a chest of ribbons that started at his shoulder seam, walked into the Parris Island chow hall at 1:47 in the afternoon, flanked by the depot's commanding officer, who had been given 9 minutes' notice and no explanation. The lunch service was winding down. A few hundred recruits froze mid-bite at the sight of that much rank moving through the hatch line. The Admiral didn't look at any of them. He scanned the kitchen through the serving window, past the steam tables, past the dish pit, until he found a tall, stooped figure in a white smock at the flat-top grill, scraping it down with long, even strokes. The Admiral stopped walking. Those who were there said afterward that he seemed, for a moment, to get younger and smaller, like a man looking at his father. He stepped around the serving line into the kitchen, which admirals do not do, and stood there until the old man turned around. Harlan Mercer looked at the 2 stars, at the face above them, and his expression did not change, but his trembling left hand went still. "Sergeant Major Mercer," the Admiral said, and his voice cracked on the second word like a teenager's. The kitchen went silent except for the dish machine. "I was a 26-year-old lieutenant at Fort Bragg in 1994, Tate said. 3rd seat from the back. You probably don't remember me." The old man studied him for a long moment. "Tate," he said, "you asked too many questions and your sutures were ugly." The Admiral made a sound that was half laugh and half something else entirely. "They're better now," he managed. "You told me something in that course. You told us a medic's hands belong to his patient, his courage belongs to his team, and his failures belong to him alone, forever. So choose carefully which ones you can carry." I have said that sentence to every class I have ever taught. I have said it at the Uniformed Services University. I said it in a tent in Kandahar the night we lost 2 of mine and I wanted to quit. His jaw worked. "I never knew until 2 hours ago that you were still alive, and a phone call tells me you've been an hour from my office this whole time salting hash browns." And then, in front of the steam tables and the dish pit and 300 recruits with their forks frozen halfway to their mouths, Rear Admiral Marcus Tate came to attention and held a salute to a man in a kitchen smock. What followed, Captain Holcomb would later say, was the only time in her career she ever saw a chow hall used as a classroom for an entire depot. The commanding officer asked the question everyone needed asked, and Admiral Tate answered it standing on the serving line like a pulpit, because he wanted the recruits to hear it too. "This man," he said, "is Sergeant Major Harlan Mercer, United States Army, retired. Special Forces. 3 tours with the Military Assistance Command Studies and Observations Group, which is a long way of saying the missions that didn't exist, across borders we weren't in, with teams that were never there. His personnel file was classified for 23 years. He holds the Distinguished Service Cross, the citation for which I am still not authorized to read to you in full, 2 silver stars and a Purple Heart with 2 clusters he never wears and has never once requested replacement copies of. In 1971, after losing a teammate to a wound no technique on Earth could stop, he worked out, alone, from a borrowed anatomy book, a method of arresting subclavian hemorrhage in the field. He proved it under fire 11 times. That method is in the textbooks today. It is called the Mercer maneuver. I have taught it on 4 continents. There are men at this moment holding their grandchildren because of what this man figured out in a hospital bed in Japan when he was 23 years old. At the Joint Special Operations Medical Training Center at Fort Bragg, there is a wall of photographs they call the Wall of the Men Who Wrote the Book. His picture has hung on it for 30 years. We thought he was dead. He let us think it. The Admiral paused and looked around the dead silent hall. When I was his student, we called him the Quiet Man, because he never told a single story about himself. 22 years he's been standing in this kitchen, feeding the United States Marine Corps breakfast, and not one of you knew that the most important pair of hands in the history of battlefield medicine was scrambling your eggs. And then the Admiral's voice dropped, and what he said next, almost too softly to hear, was the one sentence that finally broke the old man's composure. "Doc," Admiral Tate said, "Toby Farrow's sister has been looking for you for 50 years. The scrape of the grill tool against steel stopped. Harlan Mercer put both hands flat on the counter and bowed his head, and the recruits of Lima Company, who 2 weeks from the Crucible would have sworn nothing on earth could move them, watched a 78-year-old man's shoulders shake over a flat-top grill. She wants to thank you," Tate said gently, "for the letters. 51 years of letters. Every March, no return address. She kept everyone. She didn't know your name until this morning, when a trauma surgeon in Beaufort called beamed asking about a maneuver and a cook." The old man wiped his face with the heel of his hand once, the way men of his generation do, as if grief were a smudge. When he turned around, his eyes were red and perfectly steady. "The boy," he said. "Yates. What's his status?" "Out of surgery. Stable. Asking," and I'm quoting the recovery nurse, "whether the old guy got in trouble." Something moved across Mercer's face that might have been the beginning of a smile. It was at this point that HM2 Brock Tillman, who had been standing rigid by the door through all of it, crossed the chow hall floor with his cover in his hand, stopped in front of the old man, and did the hardest thing a proud man can do in front of an audience. "Sir," he said, voice wrecked, "I ordered you back from that scene, twice." Mercer looked at him for a long, unhurried moment. "You were defending your patient from an unknown variable," he said. "That was correct. I've thrown men off my casualties for less." He extended his hand, the left one, the one that trembled. "But now you know the spot, so tomorrow you'll teach it to me back. That's how it works." Tillman shook the offered hand like it was made of glass and scripture. Then the old man did something nobody expected. He raised his voice. It was the first time anyone on that depot had heard him do it, and it turned out that under the quiet was an instructor's voice, a parade ground voice, kept oiled and ready for 50 years. "All of you," he said, and 300 recruits and a 2-star admiral went still together. That corpsman and his team kept that boy's tank full for 6 minutes with their bare hands. Gauze, pressure, improvising a tourniquet onto geometry that doesn't take one. That's why there was anything left for my 2 fingers to save. You remember that. The window I used, they built. He looked at Tillman when he said it, and something in the younger man's spine reassembled itself in the real time. "I had 11 saves in that war," Mercer went on, quieter now, but the hall was so silent it didn't matter. "People put my name on the maneuver. They should have put the name of the man I learned it too late for. Every life it's taken since belongs on his ledger. Not mine, I've just been delivering his mail." Captain Holcomb, watching from beside the milk dispensers, quietly took out her phone, opened the staffing review file marked Mercer H, and deleted it. 3 days later, Harlan Mercer walked into the surgical recovery ward at Beaufort Naval Hospital carrying a paper sack. He had come the first night too, though nobody had seen him. He had sat in the parking lot in his pickup until the duty nurse he'd called confirmed the boy was through the worst of it, and then he had driven home and slept for the first time in 3 days, with the porch light burning. Now he was wearing his church clothes, which were his work clothes with a different shirt, and the old rigger's belt, laundered now but permanently darkened in one folded section, was back through his trouser loops where it had lived since Richard Nixon was president. Devon Yates was propped up in bed, pale as the sheets, his left arm strapped across his chest, a get well card from all of Lima Company on the side table, with 80-some signatures crammed onto it like a muster sheet. And when he saw who had come through the door, he tried to sit up at attention and made a sound like a stepped-on cat. "Don't," Mercer said, and sat down in the visitor's chair like it was the most natural thing in the world. He opened the paper sack and produced 2 ham and cheese sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, made by his own hands at 400 that morning. "Hospital food is a war crime," he said. "Eat." They ate in silence for a while, the boy from Dayton and the man from a riverbed in Laos, and then Devon, who had been working up his courage in the way of polite kids everywhere, said, "Sir, they told me what you did. The fingers thing. They said you invented it." Mercer chewed, swallowed, looked out the window at the marsh. "A friend of mine invented it," he said at last. "He just needed me to write it down for him. He was about your age." Devon didn't fully understand, but he understood enough not to ask more. When Mercer rose to leave, he paused at the foot of the bed and unbuckled the old olive belt and rolled it up tight and set it on the blanket over the boy's knees. "It stopped its last leak," he said. "Yours was a good one to go out on." He was gone before Devon could find a single word, and what the boy could not have known, turning that soft 55-year-old webbing over in his good hand, was that there was a name inked on the inside of it, faded almost to nothing, and the name was not Mercer. The name was Pharaoh, T, block letters in dead man's ink, because the belt had been Toby's, stripped from his gear in a riverbed in 1971 by a friend who could not save him, and could not leave anything of him behind either. Devon Yates learned this 6 weeks later on the day he graduated boot camp, when his mother in the third row sat next to a silver-haired woman from Baton Rouge named Celeste Ferro-Boudreau, who had driven 9 hours and who held Mrs. Yates's hand through the entire ceremony like they had known each other for decades. Harlan Mercer was there too, in the only suit he owned, the one he had buried Dottie in the rain in, sitting where Celeste could reach over and grip his forearm during the national anthem, which she did, and he let her, and neither of them looked at the other because some things cannot be done while being looked at. When the new Marines were dismissed and the bleachers emptied into that swirl of dress blues and weeping mothers, Private First Class Devon Yates found the old man at the edge of the crowd, came to attention, and rendered the slowest, most deliberate salute on that parade deck, and a 78-year-old retired sergeant major returned it with 2 fingers that did not tremble at all. The depot, meanwhile, changed in the quiet, structural way that places change when an admiral takes a personal interest. Captain Holcomb wrote a different report than the one she'd started. A formal commendation request, 4 pages, exhaustively documented, and stapled behind it, by her own choice, a copy of her old staffing memo with the words, "Aging Workforce, Recommend Assessment," highlighted in yellow and a handwritten note beneath, "Recommend we assess ourselves instead." It circulated all the way to the Pentagon. Within a month, every duty aid bag at Parris Island carried a junctional tourniquet, and the corpsmen's sustainment training calendar had a new recurring block, 2 hours, hands-on, titled simply, Junctional Hemorrhage, Mercer Protocols, and the instructor of record was a 78-year-old civilian who insisted on holding the class in the chow hall between meal services because, he said, the light was better and the coffee was his. HM2. Brock Tillman sat in the front row of the first class and the last row of none. He took the spot under the collarbone of a training mannequin, then of a volunteer, then, blindfolded at the old man's quiet instruction, of his own shoulder, until he could find it the way you find a light switch in your childhood home. He asked too many questions, and the old man told him so, and told him never to stop because the questions he himself had failed to ask before March of 1971 had a name and a face and a sister in Baton Rouge. Naya and Reyes learned it too, and then taught it themselves to the next rotation of corpsmen, which is how a thing a dying man's friend worked out in a hospital bed in Japan kept widening through the world like rings on water 55 years on, with no sign of stopping. That autumn his transfer finally came through, but not the one he had originally wanted. He had torn up that request and submitted a new one to the Special Operations Combat Medic course at Fort Bragg, and folded into his application packet was a 1-page letter of recommendation, typed on a manual typewriter, signed in a steady hand, Sergeant Major H. Mercer, USA, retired. Captain Holcomb drove him to the airport herself. Recruit Devon Yates became Private First Class Yates, then Lance Corporal Yates, and on the morning of his first deployment he wore a soft olive rigger's belt that quartermasters kept telling him was out of regulation and that no power on this earth could make him take off. Harlan Mercer still gets up at 03:30. He still fries the eggs, still touches the corner of the prep table as he passes, 2 fingers, light as a moth, though the dishwashers say he only does it once now. The photograph inside his locker has company. A snapshot of a graduation ceremony, 2 mothers holding hands, and a Polaroid of a grinning Lance Corporal pointing at his own belt. Every March a letter still goes to Baton Rouge, but now it has a return address, and now one comes back. And on certain mornings, if you are at Parris Island before the sun, you can stand outside the chow hall and see a single light burning in the kitchen, and a tall, stooped figure moving through it like water through a creek bed, feeding an army that has no idea most days that it is being fed by one of its own greatest hands. He likes it that way. Here is the truth that morning on the crushed shell path toward an entire depot. You have no idea who is standing next to you. The quiet ones, the stooped ones, the ones wiping their hands on their aprons, are carrying entire wars, entire libraries, entire miracles under those white smocks, and all your judgment of them reveals is the size of your own imagination. Respect costs nothing, and is owed everywhere. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel so these heroes are never invisible again, share it with someone who needs it, and type honour in the comments for Sergeant Major Harlan Mercer, for Toby Farrow, and for every quiet hand that ever held a life shut. We'll see you in the next one.